Hi, you guys. So I am now here at the West Overton Village, and I'm sitting here with Sam, who I've come to know pretty well. I think we're friends now. Yeah.
Yeah. If we're not, we're damn close.
Exactly. Yeah. I think by the end of this whiskey tasting,
you'll be my very best friend.
We're gonna all be happy at the end of this. So Sam, introduce yourself. What's your title? What do you do here? Tell me more.
We are sitting in southwestern Pennsylvania at West Overton Village. My name is Sam Komlenic. I am a Pennsylvania whiskey historian. I've been doing this for the better part of my life. Former board member here at West Overton. I just finished up my second term. This place is very special to me, as it should be to every American whiskey aficionado, because I consider West Overton Village to be the ancestral home of American whiskey.
Yeah. There's
nowhere else where you can go and visit the home of the original distiller. I am being interviewed in Abraham Overholt's distillery. We're in the distillery that was built here in 1859, I believe, and it's been preserved by Henry Clay Frick's daughter, Helen. Henry Clay Frick, the industrialist, was born on this property. I've been interested in the history of Pennsylvania whiskey for over 50 years now. I've collected various artifacts that are now on display in a gallery that has my name that nobody can pronounce.
I was going to say, I'm not going to touch that one. Right.
But it's an incredible display of Pennsylvania distillery memorabilia. And we have an educational distillery here now, so that we're showing people essentially how whiskey is made at the oldest place that whiskey was made here in the United States, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I mean, the whiskey that you all are making here is fantastic. You have a female master distiller, which I always love.
Yes,
I
sure. Me too. What's not to like?
Absolutely. This has been such an amazing journey for me. You know, I've went through and I've talked to people about the Whiskey Rebellion. I talked to the modern distillers, and I would love to kind of fill the gap that happened in between, right? That's a long...
I was going to say, how much time do you have?
I think as much time as you need, Sam.
Okay.
And I say that hesitantly.
Right.
But no, I think it's important for people to understand not just the rebellion itself, which was a huge piece of history, right? That was a shift, right? In American history.
Yes.
But also what happened after that really made Pennsylvania, and specifically the region that we're sitting in right now, that western Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh area, Pittsburgh area, what it is and why it's so known for styles like Monongahela rye, right? So let's kind of pick up wherever you want. I know that you and I went through and we toured, which was a highlight for me, not in just this trip, but in my life. We went through and we got to tour.
I'm impressed with that comment. If that was one of the highlights of your life, then I did my job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm such a nerd.
We toured a couple dead distilleries.
We did.
And we visited the graves of those distillers.
Yes, which is so cool. I think just to be able to, stand where they stood and see that in person and in real life, to me, it's one of those iconic things.
Bespoke & Bond is a refined venue space in the heart of downtown Bardstown. From intimate gatherings to elevated events, this is where your story starts. If you're planning your next experience, visit bespokeandbond.com for more.
I thought I was going to witness the death of rye whiskey in the United States. The original distillery was was built in the late 1850s. I don't know when this particular building was built, but it was later. The last whiskey came off the stills here in 1951. And then there was another time when I brought the director of West Overton out here, and I had a sample left of Dillinger whiskey that was distilled in Roughdale, and we drank it here and gave Sam some. So it's hallowed ground as far as I'm concerned. This is kind of exciting. I never get to show people the pot still side of this operation because you can't get in. All these warehouses were steam heated. That was one of the parameters of Monongahela rye whiskey. And thanks to craft distilling, rye whiskey is back, baby.
That's why I'm here. I want to tour this region. I want to understand the culture. I want to understand the history. And that way we can shine a light on the resurgence that's happening with the modern day distilleries that have been opening up here. So yeah, let's kind of dive into that, and we can talk about those two distilleries. I think that would be a great way to start. But I'm just going to give you the floor. I'm going to sit back.
Okay,
and drink
well,
some whiskey.
we a couple days ago, Whitney and I toured around to the Overholt Broadford Distillery on the Occoganee River. I took her to Sam Dillinger's grave, a 30-foot granite obelisk that's pretty
Massive,
impressive thing.
yeah.
We went to the Dillinger Distillery, which was totally rebuilt at the end of Prohibition, which is the reason it's probably standing today.
Right.
It's a relatively modern building. And then the Overholt graves up on top of that hill in Mount Pleasant, which was
Another stunning site for a different reason.
yeah.
Right. Dillinger has the monument, which is just like captures your attention almost immediately. But then at Overholt's grave, which it was not just his, it was like his entire family.
Yes. Many offspring.
Yeah. And tell me the story that
We
you
were
told me when we were
prolific,
there.
we were.
Yeah, absolutely. They wanted to make sure that they were not disturbed, and if they were, the people knew what they were disturbing, I feel like. Because the way that sat on the top of that hill, and you told me a story when we were there, and I'm gonna not steal your thunder because I'll get it wrong, about how they were finding all of these different areas and then looking back from that spot.
The George Washington story. Yeah. Well, George Washington surveyed this area as a young man. He and a fellow named Christopher Gist. And they came from the east, so they're coming through the ridge and valley region. So it's ridge after ridge after ridge after ridge. And then finally you get to the last one. You get to Chestnut Ridge. And I can just imagine Washington and Gist standing on top of that last ridge going, oh my God, there's no more. Thank heaven. Thank heaven there's no more ridges. So we are in what is called the Laurel Highlands. That's the foothills that lead up to the Ridge and Valley region, and
Yeah.
this is where it all happened in terms of rye whiskey production. This corner of Pennsylvania was the epicenter of whiskey distilling starting in the late 1700s, and that ran through, my estimate is sometime after the Civil War. Things started to slow down in the rye whiskey industry sometime after the Civil War, and I'm not sure really why. We keep hearing that Prohibition was the death knell for rye whiskey, and it pretty much was, but it was not the only factor, and it was far from the earliest factor.
Right.
I honestly think that the Civil War itself might have had some influence. The Southerners bringing bourbon and the Northerners bringing rye, and who knows where the twain may have met. But yeah, whiskey distilling here was an important thing. I know you've talked to others who know more about the Whiskey Rebellion than me, but the tax was an unfair tax.
Right.
Where the distilleries were in the east, where they were accessible and could easily be monitored, they were taxed on the output that they produced.
And that was like the Pennsylvania, that was more in the Philadelphia region.
Lancaster and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
There were a lot of distilleries around Lancaster as well because of the farming activity there.
And then there's a mountain, right? There's a mountain range.
Yes.
They always talked about it took 11 days to get from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia.
Well, when the Overholt family moved here from Bucks County in 1803, it took them 6 months by wagon.
Wow.
To move what? Not 200 miles.
Right.
Not 200 miles, took 6 months.
Yeah.
So this was an arduous thing. And in 1803, where we're sitting right now, and we're east of Pittsburgh, this was the frontier. This was the American frontier.
Yeah.
And then it expanded quickly. Within a few years, it's into Ohio and Kentucky and Illinois.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long. But at the time, this was the frontier. So these distillers were, because they were not as easy to inspect, they were charged on the potential annual output of their still, whether they ran that still 12 months a year or not. And according to Hamilton, he wanted to encourage industry on the frontier. He wanted these distillers to produce as much as they could to begin making money, because this was a barter economy.
Yeah.
There was no money on the frontier in 1790. They traded, and whiskey was a very valuable commodity for trade.
Yeah.
I like to tell people there was no ibuprofen in 1790. There was no Neosporin. People think they made this whiskey just to get drunk. No, this whiskey was a balm for your soul at the end of the day when you're clearing trees that we can't even imagine how big they were,
Right.
and rocks that we can't even imagine how big they were,
Yeah.
and they were doing this by hand with a mule or a horse.
Mhm.
So these people worked, and at the end of the day, they hurt.
Yeah.
And there's no aspirin, there's no ibuprofen. Let's have a whiskey.
And a
You
lot
know,
of
you injure yourself, you
Yeah.
clean the wound, whiskey. I mean,
it worked for everything. I mean, there were a lot of people who
it works
talked
for
about
everything.
it did. It was like a cure-all. I tend to think it still is today, but I think that's a personal opinion that's not backed up by anyone else. But I think, yeah, that this was at a lot of points, this was cleaner and easier to drink than water.
Yes.
You know, and so there were a lot of different medicinal reasons that people were drinking this and making this. And it was not something.
Money was among the primary
Absolutely.
things. Once money started to flow on the frontier,
Yeah.
this was why the Overholts went through. They were animal husbandry experts. They
Mhm.
raised cattle. They farmed here. They
Yeah.
had a huge farm. They were weavers. Some of the Overholts, when they came to this country, were already weavers.
Mhm.
So they started weaving. And what do you weave with? You weave with wool, or you weave with cotton, or you weave with linen.
Right.
And these are all agricultural products. So we're charting what we do here at West Overton best is interpret the rise of American industry from American agriculture. It all comes from agriculture. It was hard on the frontier. These distillers were taxed unfairly because they were taxed and had to pay in cash.
Right.
They had to pay the tax in cash.
And there was no cash.
They don't have cash.
Right.
So now this is a conundrum. You know, what do we do? How do we handle this? It's like we're going to stop making pennies, but we don't have any plan for phasing them out.
Right.
We're just going to get rid of them. Well, it's kind of a bit short-sighted. You need to think about. So anyway, this is what they rebelled against. They
Right.
rebelled against what they considered an unfair tax. And they also weren't going to be getting anything for this tax. You know, generally you expect something in return as a taxpayer.
Protection.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're taking their whiskey down the river. It's getting stolen by the French, the Spanish, and the Native Americans.
Right.
But there's no protection from the government. So that's the reason for the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah.
And it failed miserably. Other than vandalism on the frontier and a couple of killings, regretfully. Other than that, the Whiskey Rebellion was a big ball of nothing.
Right.
But it enforced the power. It reinforced the power of the federal government. The
Yeah.
federal government is in charge no matter what the states think.
Mhm.
You know, and that was the big intent, I think, of putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. We're going to show you that you can't do these kinds of things.
Right.
So that was the point, and then that changed everything.
So where did that leave the distilleries at the end of the rebellion? You know, how did that?
We
progress from
lost
there?
a lot of smaller distilleries.
Yeah.
You know, as in any industry, eventually the economies of scale take over, where a smaller entity cannot compete against a larger entity on price alone because
Yeah.
the larger entity has an inherent advantage. So, the smaller distillers would sort of disappear. The larger distillers would get larger because now they're absorbing that business that the smaller distillers abandoned. So it was the turn of things after the Whiskey Rebellion that sort of led into this industrial age of distilling here, which really took off. You know, it's hard to say because the technology didn't improve much on the frontier between 1790 and say 1850.
Right.
You're still pretty much running primarily pot stills. It wouldn't be until later that the 3-chamber still would be the dominant piece of equipment making rye whiskey here.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a murky area
Yeah.
of the transition from farmer distillers to industrial
Well,
distillers.
there probably wasn't a lot of documentation and other things that were well preserved to
Right.
really shine a lot of light
Right.
on that era.
Correct.
Yeah. So let's pick up where we can.
The distillery started to increase in size during the mid 1800s. You know, I would say like 1830s, things are probably starting to pick up. And as I say, we probably peaked here during or shortly after the Civil War.
Right.
In terms of production. And I don't know what it is. I still have not isolated what it is about either the location of Western Pennsylvania or the rye whiskey itself that made
Yeah.
this fall out of favor. You know, I think geography may have had something to do with it, because even though it's highly exaggerated that people left Western Pennsylvania for Kentucky during the Whiskey Rebellion, it's not totally without fact.
Right.
There are distillers who moved at that time from Pennsylvania and became some of the biggest and most noted distillers in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Jacob Spears, considered the father of bourbon. Jacob Spears was a Pennsylvania distiller. In fact, he distilled not 10 miles from here.
Okay.
Jacob Spears' family. There's a town here named Spears.
Okay.
Just saying.
It's a pretty big deal.
Just saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Daniel Shawhan was another early Kentucky distiller who had not only distilled in Pennsylvania prior to this, but had distilled in West Virginia as well. So they weren't itinerant, but they didn't want to hang around. Going to Kentucky, even though it was a state as of 1792,
Yeah.
it was still further from the reach of the federal government than Western Pennsylvania.
Right.
And I think that was one of the things that attracted a certain amount of distillers there after the Civil War.
And that was probably a big transition, right? Because one of the biggest reasons that they were able to make such great rye whiskey here was because of the land, right? As
Yes.
you said, everything was so agricultural based.
Corn is a demanding crop
Right.
on the soil. Rye is not.
Yeah.
Rye, my friend Lou Bryson is fond of saying that he was at some farmer's place and there was a plow that had some rye seed on top of it, and it was sprouting on top of it, was growing on top of the plow.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't need, rye needs nothing to grow.
Yeah.
Corn needs nitrogen. Corn needs enrichment of the soil. We didn't have great soil here. It was very stony and very hilly.
Yeah. But then whenever you transition to Kentucky, we have the ability to grow corn there,
Yes,
right? So that
correct.
makes a shift where
More open land.
yes, and so you're able to do a lot more with the agriculture, and because of that, your whiskey starts to take shape around that.
Yes,
What
absolutely.
you have on hand.
Correct.
So transitioning from that rye to that more of that bourbon style, right? 51% corn. It's like a natural progression of the times.
Yes.
It's something that's easy to do.
Yes.
But let's focus on this region because I think it's
And Kentucky distillers don't like rye. They don't like to have to work with rye. This is
Yeah.
documented.
no, I've heard this.
This is
I've heard this in
documented.
person. You're absolutely right.
Pennsylvania distillers despised corn.
Mm-hmm.
They despised it. I've seen, there's a pamphlet, I believe it's from the Meadville, Pennsylvania distillery, a promotional pamphlet that says our whiskey contains no corn, drugs, or other poison.
Which I love that.
You putting corn in your whiskey? That's poison, buddy.
Well,
so
but that's
this is how
that's
this
fantastic.
is how
That's how they
single-minded they are.
Yes, absolutely. Well, because for them, if you think about it, I mean, there's competition already. And if you're having to use rye
Yes.
to make yours, and then some guy shows up with corn whiskey or bourbon, that's a competitor. You're trying to put food on the table for your family, right?
Yes.
So it becomes that sort of competition at the time, and obviously played out a little differently than it would modern day.
Well, and going back to the Whiskey Rebellion, you know,
Yeah.
the tax that was put on in 1794, that tax only lasted for like 10 years. It was
Yeah.
gone. But I think it was 1803 that tax was repealed. So, you know, that sort of freed up things for these distillers that took the pressure off, kind
Yeah.
of. But by that time, we had lost so many of those other smaller distillers in that 10-year time period that really changed the whole face of this area in terms of distilling.
Yeah. So what are some of the distilleries that were able to kind of be remembered even now? Obviously, we've talked about Dillinger and we've talked about Old Overholt.
Gibson was
okay.
probably the biggest player in this business, in the rye whiskey business early on.
Mm-hmm.
John Gibson was a Philadelphia, as so often happens, John Gibson was a Philadelphia liquor dealer who needed more guaranteed output for his business.
Yeah.
So he built a distillery here on the Monongahela River, and it was the dominant rye whiskey distillery in Pennsylvania from its building until Prohibition.
Okay.
It was, people ask if we have the same conditions as Kentucky. You know, they have all that limestone. We're on the same slab of limestone
Right.
that Kentucky is.
Yeah.
In fact, the Gibson distillery was built from limestone blocks that were quarried on site.
Wow. Okay.
And when it was dismantled, immediately after Prohibition, it was torn apart. The only building still standing that's known to be made from blocks from the Gibson distillery is the Episcopal Church in nearby Menneson, Pennsylvania. So the distillery lives on as a church. How's that?
Listen, church pew or a bar stool. It's you gotta pick which side you're on sometimes. That's amazing, though.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm down to my last lap.
We're toasting here with we're privileged to be sipping on a
I already
1911
finished mine.
a 1911 Old Overholt, a 1980s Pennsylvania Michter's,
And a 1981
and,
very old Barton 8 year.
a very old Barton that my host graciously brought up with her. So.
Absolutely. I love
Yeah.
bringing a little bit of Kentucky here. I was worried I was going to get stoned when I showed up with a bourbon bottle. But
Stoned in a good way or stoned in a bad way?
stoned in a bad way.
Okay, yeah, okay.
But the welcoming has been very great. Everybody was very excited. I knew I had to show up with something really good. I couldn't just show up with something off the bottom shelf.
Don't
Yeah.
disappoint.
Like, I brought you bourbon, and they would be like, "Get out." But that has not been the welcoming I've received. It's quite the opposite.
we have now come to appreciate all styles of whiskey here in
Yes,
Pennsylvania.
which is
But
great.
we're very proud to have our own. We have
Absolutely,
our own
as you
style
should be. As you should be.
in this part of southwestern Pennsylvania. And Monongahela rye whiskey was special in a number of ways.
Mhm.
Number one, it contained no corn. You had your pure
No
rye.
poison.
What's that?
No poison.
Right, no poison. We put no poison in our whiskey. There was no corn, so it was either rye and barley malt or rye and rye malt.
Mhm.
Rye and barley malt was known as pure rye.
Okay.
Rye and rye malt was known as all rye. That's an
Okay.
all rye whiskey. So we had rye whiskey with no corn. We use a sweet mash fermentation exclusively. As of 1894, there was not one distillery in Pennsylvania sour mashing. It was all
Okay.
sweet mash. The three-chamber still was a very important component of this, as was heated aging. You know, in Kentucky, they like to let the weather do cold and warm, cold and warm.
Right.
We say
Kentucky
bullshit.
heartbeat is what we call it. 'Cause
We
it
say
goes in and out.
bullshit.
Yeah.
We say heat those warehouses and get aged whiskey faster.
Yeah.
And I'm of the opinion that it was an extra expense to heat your warehouse.
Absolutely.
You had to have a bigger boiler
Mhm.
for your entire operation to heat these massive warehouses.
Yeah.
You know, it's all steam piping along the wall. So it was expensive to install and it was expensive to maintain.
Right.
Because you're feeding more coal into that boiler all the time.
Which is an additional labor as well.
But they felt,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, they felt that investment was worth it.
Yeah.
And this was the first noted American whiskey style.
Mhm.
You know, you see references to Monongahela rye going very far back into the early 1800s in terms of shipping. Monongahela rye was available in San Francisco in the 1830s. It was already well known. In Moby Dick, Herman Melville talks about harpooning the whale. And when you harpoon a whale, instead of air coming out the spout, it's blood.
Okay.
Or water coming out the spout, it's blood. And he makes a mention something like, grab your cups, boys, we're gonna dance around and get a mug full of this, and it'll be just like that unspeakable old Monongahela. And when he says unspeakable, I believe he's saying that reverentially. We can't, it's like Voldemort.
Right.
He who shall not be named,
Yes.
you know?
Absolutely. I love that reference.
So as of 1840, Monongahela rye whiskey was known worldwide. Admiral Perry, on his first trip to Japan, and I forget when that was, but it was the 1840s or 50s, took gifts for this was the first white people into Japan, the first Europeans into Japan, and they took gifts for the emperor. And among those gifts was a barrel of Monongahela rye whiskey that we strongly suspect may have come from this very distillery.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Wow.
So it was a valued commodity at the time.
Absolutely.
It was America's first named whiskey style.
Yeah.
Before Kentucky Bourbon, you had New England rum prior to this,
Yes.
but that was not whiskey.
Right.
New England rum was prior to this, but not whiskey. So this was our first American. you're very proud that Congress posthumously awarded you America's Native Spirit.
Absolutely.
Well, it's not. You can have that title, but it's not.
Yeah.
This is America's Native Spirit.
I love that. And I
This is
think that's,
if you want to talk about America's Native Spirit, then it's New England rum.
yeah.
It's a New England, you know, but
Well, and I talked about that a little
that
bit.
was not our
Yeah.
agricultural product. That was
Exactly.
an agricultural product from somewhere else.
And that was, we talked to the Bradford House, talked about that, and that was part of the rebellion, right? Of they weren't wanting to drink what the English soldiers were drinking.
Yes.
And they were able to make this on their own. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't having to import this. They weren't having to do any of those things. So that was definitely part of creating the rye whiskey, I think. More of an inspiration, less of like they get credit.
Yeah.
Because we definitely don't want to give credit where it's not due.
Yeah.
I think that's
Correct.
important. So
Correct.
so then where are we going next? So as we're starting to become a worldwide, like internationally known spirit, right? That is native to America. Then what distilleries do we start seeing other than, obviously Overholt's amazing especially if that's
we start seeing, you always hear about the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish, the Germans were hugely influential. And sometimes it was Swiss, depending on where that border was. But the Germans and Swiss, the Mennonites, these were all Mennonites. You talk to Mennonites now, and the Mennonites want nothing to do with alcohol. Back then, they were all in on whiskey.
Yeah.
The Dillingers, the Overholts, the Guggenheimers, these were Germans who came here because they distilled rye in Germany and knew that they could distill rye here as well.
Yeah.
So those were big names: Dillinger, Overholt, Guggenheimer, Gibson. What other distilleries were prominent? The Pennsylvania Distilling Company of Logansport. I'm trying to think of Western Pennsylvania distilleries. The Meadville Distillery that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
That brand has been revived, and the Meadville Distillery was a huge and important and long-lasting player. Shenley grew out of Joseph Finch. Joseph Finch was a prominent distiller in Pittsburgh. Thomas More was a prominent distiller in Pittsburgh, a different Thomas More than Barton's Thomas More.
Yeah.
Which really confuses research.
Absolutely.
When one's trying to research Thomas More and doesn't want to be involved with Kentucky, it's tough to winnow out the Pennsylvania version.
Absolutely.
But these were some of the big names that carried Pennsylvania rye whiskey even into the 20th century. And I think by Prohibition, things had really started to slow down.
Want to explore bourbon in a new way? The Parlor Room is an intimate tasting experience in the heart of downtown Bardstown. Here, it isn't just about what's in the glass, it's about the story behind it. From rare pours to thoughtfully curated glasses, every seat is designed to take you deeper into bourbon. Book your experience at parlorroomtastings.com.
I think it was built in 1859. It was built before the Civil War originally, but it was expanded substantially. And I couldn't tell you what the dates of expansion here were. The last whiskey came off the stills here in 1951. The warehouses remained open. Seagram's used them, along with the warehouses at Dillinger, where we're going to be going next. Used those to store whiskey from other distilleries. I talked to people that worked in those warehouses in Ruffsdale when Seagram owned them. Dillinger supposedly closed in 1947, but I've seen anecdotal evidence that said it was in operation until the early 50s, but I haven't corroborated that. So here are your mash tuns, one on either side. And this is the base for a 15-foot diameter 3-chamber still. Come over here and look up.
How many 3-chamber stills were there back in the day?
A lot.
Oh, there were?
All of them in Pennsylvania and Maryland.
Okay.
Kentucky did not do 3 chambers. This was a 15-foot diameter still that went up that far. This is the beer well. This is where they would dump the fermented mash to distill it. This is a 25,000 gallon vessel. Their fermenters were 24,000 gallons. So when they filled this, there was 1,000 gallons of spare room on top. And I'm guessing that that's where the mash came in from the fermenting house over there. All of this went south after World War II. They weren't allowed to distill whiskey, but a couple days a year, they were distilling industrial alcohol. So I think once that stopped and that income stream, you will see bottlings. I can tell you exactly what year a particular extra age bottle of Overholt is by the date on the label. You know, it was a 4-year whiskey. Yeah. And you'll see him 6-year, that was bottled in 1957. 8-year, that was bottled in 1959. They had all this remaining whiskey that wasn't selling, so they were selling an 8-year-old whiskey essentially for a 4-year-old price because nobody wanted rye whiskey anymore. It was dead. Yeah. I thought I was going to witness the death of rye whiskey in the United States. In the 70s, there were still 2 Pennsylvania distilled rye whiskeys available, Old Overholt and Sam Thompson. I honestly thought I would see that disappear. And thanks to craft distilling, rye whiskey is back, baby. So, yeah, I own blueprints from the Overholt Distillery and the Dillinger Distillery in Roughdale, which is the only distillery in the United States known to have operated pot stills after Prohibition. I just can't imagine what this was like when it was cranking, you know? 24,000 gallons of mash at a time. So this is the fermenting house. They would grind the grain over in the mill that we walked past, they'd run it over to where those mash tuns were in the distilling house. After they mashed it in, it would be pumped over here to ferment, and then pumped back to the distillery to distill. So these were your 24,000 gallon fermenters, and there's more in this annex. They made a lot of whiskey here, and it was all rye. They made nothing but rye whiskey in this distillery. This was the biggest. This was the biggest.
Like even modern
to my knowledge.
Even modern times?
No, I mean, it's not as big as Beam. It's not as big as,
Right.
you know, I don't know. Is this comparable to Barton? I don't know. You know, it's not Beam,
No,
but it's probably bigger than Barton.
I could see that.
But this was all fermenting capacity. These things were bubbling all the time with happy yeast gobbling up the sugars and making happy alcohol. There was a fire here in 1904 in one warehouse. People walked from Connellsville. When we turned off at 119, that was coming into Connellsville. People walked from Connellsville to here to see the fire, and they brought a train in from Pittsburgh so that people from Pittsburgh could see the burning warehouse, and they were able to limit it to one warehouse. Nothing else caught fire. Yeah, all these warehouses were steam heated. That was one of the parameters of Monongahela rye whiskey. In Kentucky, the rickhouses breathe. They're cold and warm, cold and warm. Here, they were never under 70 degrees. They were heated in the winter because that is how these guys wanted to accelerate the aging. So they opened the steam lines in the other warehouses to soak all the barrels to keep those other warehouses from catching fire. I drove up the hill and parked because I had no idea where this was. And the caretaker was driving his tractor around, and I stopped him, and he said, "Oh, it's just on the other side of those trees. You can't miss it." So I'm looking for stuff like this. Yeah. And all of a sudden I go, "Holy crap!" Yeah. 9 feet wide at the base, 30 feet tall, 16 horses to get that top stone up here. So on that first visit, I walk up to this monument, and I went to touch it. And I got about this far away, and this blast of cold air ran between. I stood back. I'm not a superstitious guy or ghosts or anything, but somebody was talking to me here. So I finally then put my hand on it, but it was a moment. See those ventilators? That was the fermenting house right here they had a column still and a beer still and a rectifying column, so they could distill anything here. So note those ventilators, because we're going to go around the other side. This is kind of exciting. I never get to show people the pot still side of this operation because you can't get in. These two arched openings were the basis for the pot stills. Inside that room right there were two massive copper pot stills that were installed after Prohibition to make quote unquote Scotch whiskey here. It was the only distillery in the United States known to use pot stills after Prohibition. It was thought that pot stills went extinct at Prohibition, and that's not true, because here we are in Roughdale, beautiful downtown Roughdale. That little settlement that we drove through was called Bethany. That's where Sam Dillinger's original distillery was. It burned in 1881 and he relocated here. This is his original 1881 warehouse. This is the only original building standing except the boiler house.
Did you drink all of these?
I wish. Wouldn't that be an adventure? Oh my God!
Right?
Well,
Could you imagine?
I've drunk some of them. Yeah, absolutely, drank some of them.
That's definitely my first question. No, so okay, so we're looking at the bottles that have been collected.
This is my collection.
This is your collection.
This is my collection for the most part. There are bottles from museum inventory that are part of this, but the great majority of these bottles were bottles that I collected. In fact, all of the artifacts in here, most of them are from my collection.
Yeah.
I humbly like to think of myself as Pennsylvania's minor answer to Oscar Getz.
I was gonna say that. I swear I was gonna say that.
With all due respect, Oscar, you have a lot more stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I think you're on the right path.
Well, I wanted to show you, we had talked earlier about, you wanted to know which ones were the big brands, the ones that had survived and thrived. Mm-hmm. Joseph Finch purchased Thomas Moore's distillery on the old distillery on the south side of Pittsburgh and went into production and almost overnight became a huge sensation.
Okay.
So all these bottles, we've got a lot of bottles in here. Here's where Finch's Golden Wedding brand starts, and it runs down through here.
Okay.
And you might notice at the end that I've included two bottles for illustrative purposes.
Yeah.
Golden Wedding is now a Canadian product. See, Golden Wedding, Canadian whiskey.
Uh-huh.
This is from the 70s maybe.
Okay.
That Golden Wedding, and look at this one. Golden Wedding whiskey, where's that from?
Monongahela? Old Judge. Old Judge was the one who originally created Old Fitzgerald. If it's the same one.
Baja California, Mexico.
Interesting.
Golden Wedding, I believe, is the only whiskey brand that has been distilled in every country on the North American continent.
Oh,
It
wow.
was originally distilled in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It moved to Mexico during Prohibition.
Right.
That was Joe Beam's distillery.
Okay.
They dismantled the Old Judge distillery and rebuilt it outside of Tijuana. And there is a postcard showing barrels on rails out in the desert.
Wow.
That's how they aged that whiskey.
Just in the desert heat.
Because it was fast.
Yeah.
You're out at literally barrels stretched out on rails in the desert.
Yeah.
Is how they were. So that's a bottle. I was so thrilled to get that bottle.
That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. And another one was Gibson.
Yeah.
Gibson starts almost at the end of this row and runs down to here. So Gibson was another major brand.
So cool. And so what was their claim to fame, right? Like
Gibson,
Uh-huh.
Gibson was in early and had a lot of money behind them.
okay.
So they were an early distillery. They got in here and built a distillery early on and maintained that distillery throughout till Prohibition. And like I said earlier, it was absolutely dismantled. Like within a couple of months,
Yeah.
they were selling the stones for $2 a wagon load.
Wow.
So we need to go to church in Monessen and worship in the whiskey church.
I think a lot of people do.
So yeah, those were our big brands.
Okay.
You know, we had
Hennessy, Dillinger.
Guggenheimer, and Dillinger was prolific. Dillinger bottled rum, both Cuban and St. Croix rum. They distilled corn whiskey.
Yeah.
They were one of 3 distilleries that I'm aware of in Pennsylvania that distilled bourbon.
Okay.
Dillinger made bourbon after Prohibition. Well, once they built that new distillery, they had the capability to make anything.
Yeah.
It was a modern distillery and they could make anything.
Mm-hmm.
So they made corn whiskey, they made blended whiskey, they made spirit whiskey, where you're down below 20%
Right.
real whiskey in the mix. So yeah, Dillinger was prolific, as was Continental. Continental's the Keystone State, the old
Mm-hmm.
classic. Patrician, Rittenhouse, that was a Continental
I was
brand.
gonna say, there's a couple of brand names that I
Yes.
recognize. So Rittenhouse is obviously still made now, and that's made by Heaven Hill, correct?
Correct, yes.
So that was Continental originally, and did that originate here in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, Philadelphia.
Wow, Philadelphia was
Yeah.
okay.
And it was made by, originally the company was called Publicker Chemical Company. And they came up.
Terrible name for whiskey.
Publicker, yes, P-U-B-L-I-C-K.
No, just the chemical company
Oh,
part.
Publicker
That's I don't
Chemical
know that I would
Company.
want to drink chemicals.
Well, you know, I mean, most of your distillers now have a chemical engineering degree.
Absolutely,
You know.
but in as a consumer,
Yes.
I don't think of it as chemicals
Publicker
that I'm
Chemical
drinking,
Company.
right? You know?
Yeah. But it's fun to look back at the history of some of this stuff.
Yeah, like this
And-
bottle right here is wild.
This is post-Prohibition. This is after Dillinger adopted Thomas More as their flagship brand.
Okay.
Dillinger became their blended whiskey after Prohibition.
Yeah.
And they had purchased or acquired the Thomas More name, which was another very famous name. And those pinch bottles are both from Dillinger and Ruffsdale. And that closure on top is a patented closure. The family that owned the distillery also had interest in the ceramics business, and that is a top that prohibits the refilling of that bottle. You know, all these bottles say
Yeah.
do not refill under federal law. That went till I think 1963.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, they came up with a closure that was cemented to the bottle. It does not come off.
Oh,
You
wow.
can take that little cap off on the top, but that's it. And there's a little thing in there a little jigger, I don't know how it works, but
Yeah.
it'll allow you to pour it out, but
Measures
it
it
won't
out?
allow you to pour anything back in.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so all 3 of those closures
Yeah, I
are
see those.
really, truly only affiliated with that distillery.
That's so amazing.
Crazy.
Are there so here's Michter's. We have a couple of Michter's bottles, which are by the way
Michter's?
stunning.
Yes.
It's like a genie bottle over here.
Yes. Well, that's the pot stills that they had installed
Right.
during the bicentennial,
Yeah.
which are now operational at Michter's Fort Nelson Distillery in Louisville.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't
Those,
realize that.
yeah, that's those stills.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, those stills came from Michter's in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
But that was our last distillery. They released this product, quarter whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
They claimed that back in the day, you didn't drink whiskey at high proof for table use and for family use. You took it down to 25 proof.
Oh,
It was
wow.
called quarter whiskey. Well, they weren't allowed to call it whiskey at the time if it's
Right.
bottled below 80 proof. So this was just White Dog. Their quarter whiskey was 80 proof White Dog. And this
Wow.
was available in the liquor stores in Pennsylvania. I didn't buy that bottle. It came in green and yellow. I had the yellow bottle that I purchased and drank. It wasn't really very exceptional stuff, but it was another thing where, we're trying to make money here
Yeah.
at the end of industrial distilling in Pennsylvania, and how do we sell more whiskey? So,
Tell me about this label wall, because I love this too. I want to chat a little bit about it.
I have an
Label marketing, what is this we're looking at?
I'm a compulsive collector.
No.
Compulsive. And I have more than one collection. I actually have 3, maybe you could count maybe 4 collections.
Okay.
But part of the whiskey collection is an album full of old Pennsylvania whiskey labels.
This is so cool.
I have probably, I don't know, a couple hundred.
From Dillinger, I have over 60 different labels from Dillinger alone. We're standing in the ancestral home of American whiskey, right here. No place else where you can go and experience the true history of a family brand that has existed from 1810 until the present than here. So I would encourage,
And it's such a beautiful area.
all those aficionados who have tuned in for this incredibly compelling presentation, I would encourage them to come to Western Pennsylvania and visit West Overholt.